This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The creators of this work do not encourage or condone discrimination or violence towards real-life government or religious organizations. Any similarities depicted within to such entities are also purely coincidental. When you open up a game, there are many things you might expect, but this is likely not one of them. However, it's something the Japanese developer ATLUS have done with several of their past releases, and have continued with the release of Metaphor ReFantazio, that I'm just going to call Metaphor from here on out. The JRPG fantasy adventure game released on the 11th of October 2024, in collaboration with subsidiary Studio Zero and longtime Western publishing partner and parent company Sega. Sega, who moved into purely developing and publishing games in 2001, after the commercial failure of the Dreamcast, acquired ATLUS in 2013. While the last 5 years since the Japanese release of Atlus's Persona 5 Royal have left fans begging for another game in the franchise, the developers served up Metaphor ReFantazio as a glimpse into how the Persona series gameplay model could look when taken out of the Japanese high school setting. I'm intending to analyse both the game, that has received acclaim from fans and critics alike, as well as my own approach to it, and in a wider sense how I approach play in general, looking at why I started and continue to play this game, and the aspects of the game that stand out to me the most. In particular, I want to dive into the origins of the JRPG genre, as well as trying to understand exactly which parts of the game aid in the creation of both Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, referred to by Edward Ross as the sensation of skill and mastery that comes from being really good at something difficult, and what Weibel and Vismath refer to as immersive experiences in gaming. This is a work of fiction. There have been many debates online as to why Atlus placed this disclaimer at the beginning of their games. Some believe it to be a precaution to protect them from the outrage of religious groups, the likes of which has been seen as far back as criticism of Dungeons & Dragons in the 1970s and 80s, with evangelical Christian groups linking the game to Satanism, occultism, and witchcraft. Others argue that this disclaimer is more meta when reflected on with an understanding of the context of the games, although I would argue that before anything else, this disclaimer, along with the beginning of the game in which the player is addressed directly and asked to name the protagonist and also give their own name, directly places the player outside of Johann Huizinga's magic circle, a concept that isolates the game from the more serious tasks of daily living. Indeed, by breaking this fourth wall between player and the game they play, Conway argues that through this, the game inverts a hierarchy of control, taking it away from the player. The placement of this moment at the very start of Metaphor's story feels a deliberate decision to completely break a player's sense of immersion before they have had a chance to immerse themselves deeply in the game. By immersion here, I'm particularly talking about Cheng and Ken's vision of a concept that leads gamers to play for hours at a time. Throughout this video, I'm going to discuss the ways in which Metaphor breaks this sense of immersion at the start of the game, but then brings players back around, to the point at which I can say that I have been fully immersed in my time playing. Before I really get into analysis of Metaphor itself, I think it's important to take a look at why I bought it and how I even got to this point in general. The first video game I bought for myself was a copy of Inazuma 11 for the Nintendo DS from a GameStation bargain bin in the late 2000s, which, like Metaphor, is a JRPG. This genre, an initialism of Japanese role-playing game, is a popular genre that Malandine argues is rooted in nostalgia and is associated with previous moments of greatness in video game history. More than this, while the gameplay loops of JRPGs may vary, from sports games like Inazuma 11 to turn-based and real-time combat like Metaphor, they almost always immerse players in a carefully crafted story. This careful crafting of storylines can be seen in Metaphor, in which it uses a narrative structure known as the String of Pearls model, which Arseth explains as, within each pearl there is plenty of choice, but on the level of the string there is no choice at all. Through the background footage throughout this section, you can see that each area is quite linear, with occasional sections that can be explored to uncover items, but nothing that fundamentally changes the course of the story. Before we get too off track though, there is more than my pre-existing love of JRPGs that brought me to Metaphor. While undoubtedly a large part of it, my console of choice, PC, and the store that I bought the game off of, Steam, the platform with a de facto monopoly on the Western PC gaming market, also play essential parts in my discovering of the game. I eventually decided to purchase the game due in part to advertisements on the Steam store, but also that Atlus made a free demo for the game available. As Alha et al. Note, word of mouth, reviews and demos are important factors when buying a retail game, and after sinking around 2.5 hours in the demo, I felt much more confident about purchasing the game, which sent me back around 40 quid. As such, the way in which digital stores such as Steam market games and the existence of free demos or trials of games are both effective means to get players, such as myself, to engage with games that they otherwise might have passed on.
This feels an appropriate time to discuss part of why Metaphor and several games in the Persona franchise, namely 3, 4 and 5, stand apart from many other JRPGs, which is their inclusion of a social simulation system, along with social stats in this game named Royal Virtues of Courage, Wisdom, Tolerance, Eloquence and Imagination. The in-world explanation for this system is that the player character gathers followers and forges bonds with allies, in which a player can choose to allocate time outside of the traditional JRPG dungeons, instead meeting with members of their dungeon crawling party and strengthening the bonds between them, which will in turn grant passive abilities that benefit players when attempting combat, or sometimes new archetypes, a rather tongue-in-cheek name given to the different classes players can assign to the player character and their NPC companions. Through player decisions, such as spending time with NPCs around the world, their royal virtues can be leveled up, with this progression unlocking side quests and more features around the world, thus encouraging players to engage with optional content promising rewards for improving their player character. Additionally, this mechanic can influence players to continue with the game through the creation of a parasocial relationship, that is, a one-sided relationship between the player and the characters within the game. Elvery argues that games offering interactions which feel realistic are more likely to bring on a stronger parasocial relationship than with a character from film or television, due to the level of involvement a player has in this. This is a prime example of how Metaphor's mechanics both entice players and keep them around. If I choose to spend time with a former noble Stroll, I will feel in-game improvements based on the level of the bond between he and the player character, and the dialogue within this social simulation has a chance of strengthening the parasocial bond between me, the player, and his character as well. Indeed, it feels as though Atlus are aware that for players of Metaphor, this is not their first rodeo. Whether it be their straightforward name this protagonist approach to the traditional JRPG early game, the adaptation of previous follower or confidant in Persona 5 mechanics in a way that affects gameplay and potential late game story elements in some way, or even the relative difficulty of the first dungeon, especially compared to previous Atlus titles, seems as though the developers aimed this game more towards pre-existing fans, although that isn't to say that they neglect new players. Throughout quite a lot of this background footage, you've undoubtedly seen a few tutorials, which are commonplace within long JRPGs, and I think this makes a lot of sense. If Metaphor takes the average player nearly 65 hours to complete only the main story, before even taking into account side quests and optional content, there are going to be a lot of mechanics that they need to learn, so the question instead becomes how you go about teaching players in a non-irritating manner. As Anderson et al. Concluded, it is necessary to break complex games down into smaller chunks that can be learned through exploration, and I feel that continuing to litter short tutorial excerpts throughout the game as more mechanics become available to players is appropriate. This both prevents a feeling of being overwhelmed with too many options and bells and whistles early on, and allows players to more frequently enter this flow state that I experienced almost as soon as I began to play the game. As well as this, Johnson and Wiles explain that an essential element of flow is a match between one's skills and the challenges they face in-game, which goes to show that gradual introduction of game mechanics allows players to adjust to the game gradually over their time playing. In these early areas, taking in the incredible OST composed by Shoji Meguro, slashing and taking advantage of Metaphor's insta-kill on low-leveled mobs, and then trying to reach an unscathed victory, a system in which rewards earned from combat are increased if nobody in the party takes damage. When pulled into this turn-based combat by harder enemies, I found myself completely immersed in the game, to the point at which I'd forgotten I was even recording footage alongside it. This complete, all-encompassing focus I had on the game is one of the strongest I've experienced in gaming in the last few years. Naturally, there is more to the game that facilitated this flow state than I've discussed so far. I would say that this game has one of the most beautiful UIs or user interfaces that I've seen in gaming. While I could sit here and wax poetic about the game's use of music, graphics, or the minimap used to direct players through in-game dungeons, revealing where and when they can interact with objects in the world, I particularly want to focus on the in-game menus. I feel that when we look at video game menus, it's very easy to pick up on when they're bad. Maybe they're very slow or unresponsive, which can irritate players and gets in the way of what I think is extremely important. Games are supposed to be fun. I'm not having a good time when I have to sit through heaps of poorly controlling menus, which is why Metaphor's use of beautifully designed, responsive menus with flashy transitions between them is so effective. For all the talk about this flow state that gamers enter, as Arsenal states, the goal of successful game design is meaningful play, and I feel that the backbone of this, especially in JRPGs that encourage the collection and swapping out of different gear, whether it be class-specific weapons and armor or healing items, is efficient menu controls that allow the player to get back to the action as quickly as possible, but also that these menus are aesthetically pleasing and conducive to this player enjoyment that facilitates the feeling of flow. Now, I haven't much yet discussed Metaphor's story. Naturally, for a story-based game to keep players coming back, it has to be engaging from the very beginning. This is most definitely the case. Within this, I'd like to take a closer look at player agency. Tannenbaum and Tannenbaum explore agency through Janet Murray's description as the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices. However, I'd argue that realistically, most games don't really give you, as a player, that much agency. Sure, in Metaphor you can choose the classes of each member of your party and the way that you navigate dungeons and turn-based combat, but functionally, the story will progress in the same manner irrespective of how you play the game. That is, provided you finish each dungeon in the time the game allots. On top of this, I'd like to touch back on characters and the concept of death flags. Essentially, death flags are a name given to events that transpire in games that allude to or foreshadow a character's impending death. Death flags, a common occurrence in JRPGs, are also found in Metaphor, the early game mentor character, Grius. This example of a grizzled veteran who imparts knowledge on the player character, teaching players about certain game mechanics, is a classic role within the JRPG genre as well. After progressing to the capital Grand Trad area, Grius leaves the party, promising to return after finishing a mission he must do alone. This is a clear death flag, which should raise alarm bells for experienced players in the genre. I remember talking to my friends at this moment in the story, saying, he's definitely gonna die, right? Here, a player is utterly powerless to stop Grius from leaving, with no agency over what transpires next. And, of course, Grius is murdered right in front of the protagonist in a cutscene, and no decisions made leading up to this point in game can change this. Some dislike the presence of cutscenes in video games, with Newman discussing how the role they play has come under considerable scrutiny. In particular, there is an argument over whether the presence of cutscenes interrupts gameplay and gets in the way of flow states, or in fact helps to link the overall narrative progression of the game to the gameplay, thus elevating the experience of play. I would argue that the lack of agency afforded to players in this section is a deliberate tactic used to convey the helplessness of the situation, and the choice to have Grius' death occur in a cutscene is an effective way of removing power from the player, acting as a clear moment of change, with the gameplay reflecting this as a switch to dungeon crawling and social simulation from the previously purely linear gameplay progression. In a sense, this is where the real game begins, and players' relative sense of security is destroyed in the moment with the death of a close party member. As Wisocki states, the death of characters in other JRPGs, such as Final Fantasy VII, are often used to signal the climactic function in the narrative of a moment. I would agree that by this point in the game, Grius' death is a focal point in the development of Metaphor's narrative, and I believe that with reference to the parasocial relationships built between players and NPC party members, players could be motivated to keep playing to avenge their fallen comrade, with the previous feeling of helplessness encouraging them in this mission. Due to my chosen platform to play games on, PC, I've had a few issues in my time playing Metaphor, which have undoubtedly tainted my experience. As might be obvious in a few clips, I've experienced stutters, lag, and occasional complete screen freezes, as my now 9-year-old device tries to keep up with a game that launched just over a month ago. Indeed, while I've been editing this footage, it's been making somewhat terrifying noises and threatening to explode, taking me, my housemates, and about half the street with it. More importantly, however, these issues potentially affect the level of immersion that a player is able to attain. If immersion is affected by what Swink describes as game feel, of which real-time control or precise continuous control over a moving avatar is essential, then the game ceasing to acknowledge any controller inputs or slowing down to a snail's pace will unquestionably have a negative effect on player experience. This can, however, be seen as a user issue, as especially with PCs it is nigh on impossible for studios to create a game that will run flawlessly on nearly decade-old technology. Throughout this video, I've had Metaphor's music, composed by Shoji Meguro, a former ATLUS in-house composer who was contracted to work on the project, playing in the background. It is explained early on in Metaphor's story, within the first few minutes, that the protagonist's companion, a fairy named Gallica, is the source of the in-game music, playing it to rouse her crew. The framing of the background music as diegetic allows for a greater level of immersion, as Jorgensen explains the apparent need for listeners to materialize sound or connect it to a source. Through the in-world explanation for background music and linking it to a companion character, the music becomes part of the game mode, an accompaniment for the party's actions, the high and the low points, the triumph and the mourning of characters and timely deaths. Finally, and maybe most importantly, why do I like Metaphor ReFantazio? I feel it'd be remiss of me to not touch on the point that, as a white man, I embody several characteristics of the traditional player one in gaming, as Chess remarked that a lot of times these games are more frequently designed for me, as part of the primary target audience of console games. This can even be seen in the Metaphor's protagonist, a male character with the canonical name of Will, or whatever the player decides, being a significantly easier character for me to relate to as a male gamer when compared to a female perspective. While these beliefs are not as straightforward in gaming as they used to be, there still remains an element of this player one that still controls decisions made by developers, despite the progress made and the understanding that these games are made to be played by all, not just a select target demographic. As I've already said, JRPGs have been a favourite of mine since I started playing games, and I feel that Metaphor ReFantazio continues this trend. As is crucial with games of its ilk, the game starts hot and gets hotter, keeping aspects of Atlus's previous successes but building upon them. As I get older, I've grown a little bored of their Persona series' settings, but Metaphor offers a new take on a classic formula, with NPC characters you either love or love to hate, a beautiful soundtrack that elevates the experience of traversing the carefully designed world and balancing dungeon crawling and side quests, helping locals and strengthening bonds with party members alike. As such, all of these elements combine to create an effective and immersive world that players won't get bored of and can, providing coursework deadlines allow them to, spend hours upon hours taking in the experience. While many have criticised the state of AAA releases in recent years, Metaphor ReFantazio remains for me a sign that not all hope is lost.